Welcome to the Legends Behind the Craft podcast, where we feature top leaders in the wine and craft beverage industry with your host, Drew Hendricks. Now, let's get started with the show.
Drew Thomas Hendricks here. I'm the host of the Legends Behind the Craft podcast, where I talk with leaders in the wine and craft beverage industry. Today's episode, sponsored by Barrels Ahead. At Barrels Ahead, we work with you to implement a one-of-a-kind marketing strategy, one that highlights your authenticity, tells your story, and connects you with your ideal customers. In short, we help wineries and craft beverage producers unlock their story to unleash their revenue. Now, we recently came out with a new wine club re-engagement product. And if you're interested, give us a call or hit us up on barrelsahead.com today to learn more. I am super excited today to talk with Paul Bonarrigo, CEO of Messina Hof. Paul, how's it going?
It's going great. Nice and warm.
Nice and warm, Paul. So thank you so much for joining us today. So you were, Messina Hof was the fourth winery in Texas. What was it like kind of growing up in the vineyard and being part of all that?
So Messina Hof started in 1977. That's when my parents really got into the business, and their start was through an experimental vineyard. And so at the time, there was obviously a long history of growing grapes in Texas. However, not really a belief that there was a potential for a strong wine industry. So there was a study going on in multiple sites throughout the state. And my parents, although not in the industry at that time, were fortunate to come across the path of the gentleman who was Ron Perry. Mm-hmm. And so they planted the experimental vineyard. And then, I came around a little after that. So I was born the same year that our second block was planted. So ever since I was a little kid, I worked in the vineyard and I worked in the winery. I got a chance to see all elements of the business. So you could say that it's in my blood to be in the wine business.
Oh, for sure. Now, what was it like? I mean, it was the dawn of the industry there. You had first 1 acre experimental block, and then the second block. What was that?
So the first block was a bunch of different varieties to try to see what would grow well. Mm-hmm. From that study, they determined that Lenoir, which is also called Black Spanish, was the ideal grape variety for our site. Mm-hmm. There were multiple other varieties that performed in kind of different scales of positive. And so over time, the majority of our vineyard, almost all of it, was planted out in Lenoir here at the estate here in Bryan, Texas. Mm-hmm. However, that same research that was done throughout the state helped stimulate what varieties really were planted for the next 20, 30 years from that point. So, me personally, a lot of that was being able to work alongside of my parents and watch that passion that mm-hmm. when you watch any industry in the pioneering phase, it's so much struggle and it's so much of that personal energy that really drives the business. I don't think I know two harder working people than my parents. So to be able to work alongside of them growing up was an absolutely amazing experience and really, helped set us up for where we are today, obviously.
Yeah. What, like growing up, you talk about the passion and talk to me about that. What was it, the passion that drew you into it, the grapes? I mean, there is the struggle. There's so much effort that it takes to plant the vineyard, make the wine. But what was it like in the early days before you're even, an adult? As a child, what was the lure?
Well, so, on the vineyard side, any agriculture, you get that sensation of your hard work goes into the ground, into the working of the vines, and then in the end of that hard labor comes this beautiful fruit that gets converted into wine. When I was young, obviously, like I somewhat understood the wine side, like I got the juice and stuff, but I obviously didn't understand the wine until I was a teenager or later down the road. But the vineyard from very early on was very special to me. That's where I spent most of my time. And that idea of being a vine tender, mm-hmm. we're big about our faith as well. So obviously, when you're in agriculture, you're dependent upon the weather, you're dependent upon all the different elements you don't necessarily control. So having that bearing and patience and understanding that you just have to kind of go with what God gives you in the vineyard was also a big piece of my overall character growing up as well. And then as I got older and started understanding the winemaking side of things, winemaking is such a fascinating, viticulture also combines science and art.
Mm-hmm.
Wine side seems to be just much more in your face, the science and art piece of it, because you can understand all the chemistry and all the different things that go into making wine. But if you don't have a palate, if you can't understand kind of the potential of every lot as it comes through the winery, you're really not going to be able to make great wine. And so my dad was able to, he is an incredible artist as a winemaker. And so he was able to pass that on to me, understanding the flavors that you're experiencing from the fruit, what you're hoping to achieve in the wine before it even begins, and understand how that correlates to decisions that are made in the vineyard way before we even get the fruit to the winery. So I think all those pieces were very special to the passion that was planted in me and really eventually came out whenever I came back to the business.
Yeah, absolutely. So you did take a break after high school from the wine industry and did a stint in the Marines.
Yeah, so I like to joke that I was so excited about the wine industry that I went off and joined the Marine Corps. But the funny story is that, in the winery, you have all sorts of different characters that work in a winery setting, especially in Texas, where they're really, especially for the first 20 years, there wasn't like a staffing source that was wine oriented unless they were coming from the West Coast. Most people that were getting into the industry, this is their first time getting into it. So I happened to be working alongside as a kid a bunch of Marines, former Marines, and so they kind of put it in my brain, and I was super excited about it. From age 13, that was what I was going to do. So I set out to do that. I went to the Naval Academy up in Maryland, and then I commissioned as an officer in the Marine Corps. I met my wife when I was at the Naval Academy, and then also deployed 3 times. And eventually kind of that journey led me back here. Even though my intention was always to come back to the business, I think, as a young kind of late teens / early 20s person, I think the idea of a 20-year career in my brain made sense, that I could do that and still come back and my parents would still be involved. But it was only on my second deployment when my dad called me and said, like, we've been doing this for 35 years. I mean, we can't go another 10, 15 years at the current pace of growth that Messina Hof was experiencing. And so everything lined up. We were making family decisions at the time, me and my wife, and so we decided to come back. It was actually perfect timing. So everything rolled together, and the transition time when we came back was very quick.
Was it?
Really, between 2010 and 2013 is when we transitioned all elements of the business. So
now, when you came back from having served in the military, what sort of, I can only imagine how many transferable skills there were as far as leadership and operations. Talk to me about that.
Well, so my degree was in systems engineering. Of course, at the academy, they require you to take a lot of science to chemistry, biology, and other things like that. I was fortunate that I actually had a pretty decent foundational knowledge. I had done some UC Davis courses actually in high school as well.
Oh, wow.
And I completed my certificate from UC Davis whenever I returned back. So, like, if you take some of the foundational educational pieces that I had, plus the leadership, operational management is such an important part of my role that I held. I was a command and control officer. That did help me significantly to fill gaps whenever I first came back, because obviously I'm jumping into it. I'm jumping onto a moving train here, because if you look at that time period between 2005 and 2012, I would say our industry had a lot of opportunities. We got the right to ship. The growth of direct consumer in Texas was absolutely massive during that time. The number of vineyards being planted during that time was huge. So there was a ton of logistics and operations that go on a daily basis that I was able to use a lot of the skill set that I had learned while I was in the Marine Corps with the business, and implement systems. Because when you look at, if anybody who's a founder, like when I came back, the organizational structure of the company was like my parents and then everybody was flat. Everybody pretty much reported to my parents. Mm-hmm. The founders, it was their baby. They didn't, they wanted to be involved with all the decision making and everything. You can't do that beyond a certain point. So we had the opportunity to kind of put in a little bit more of a tiered structure of management, bring on some new managers within the company as we kind of tiered out some different things. And that really helped us to go into our next phase of growth, which was the regional opening of new locations.
Yeah, like since you took on as CEO, you've doubled the size of Messina Hof.
And at this point, triple the size.
Triple. Oh my Lord. Yeah.
Yeah. But yeah, one of the first things that, and my parents had already identified this before we came back, which was distribution is such a cutthroat market. And we have been blessed since 1987 to have a presence in the distribution market. Mm-hmm. But when you look at Texas as an overall wholesale market, Texas wine controls a very small portion of the distribution. It's very heavily dominated by California. There's obviously a lot of wine sales that happen here. They invest a ton of money here. I would say that there is the road to trying to grow that piece is pretty hard. However, the direct to consumer market is huge. I mean, we have so many people in Texas that want to drink wine, that want to love Texas wine. But I would say the gap for us at the time was education and trial. Mm-hmm. So we identified immediately, hey, we need to open locations that we can touch people from different areas of the state. And so that 2011, we opened our Hill Country location on Highway 290. Mm-hmm. We opened in 2014 in Grapevine, Texas, which is up between Dallas, Fort Worth. And then last year we opened down in Richmond, which is the west side of Houston. We call it's a Harvest Green development. Mm-hmm. But those regional nodes have allowed us, and each one of them kind of has its own character and flavor in terms of the services and experiences that. Mm-hmm. But it allowed us to be able to connect directly with the customer. That ultimately pays dividends in the wholesale market too. Sure. But that personal connection is that's a big piece of our brand and what we like. Our motto is called "Join the Family." So mm-hmm. we want people to feel directly connected to us, and that has allowed us to be able to do that on a much bigger scale.
Yeah. So your family first started in Bryan, Texas. That's where the original one is. And your vineyards, you were telling me, is up in the High Plains.
Right.
Give us a little, for all of our listeners across the country, give us like a little rundown of Bryan versus Fredericksburg, Hill Country versus the High Plains.
So to kind of take any one step even further back than that, there's 8 AVAs currently in Texas, although there is a lot of efforts right now to establish more because the size of our state, I mean, we are bigger than France. Mm-hmm. En masse. So, and the terroir spread across the state is significant. So we believe that we could almost grow any variety in Texas somewhere. It's just a matter of determining what those best sites are. The two biggest growing regions currently are the High Plains, which grows about 65% of the fruit, 70% of the fruit in Texas. And then the Hill Country, which grows about 15 to 20% of the fruit in Texas, but is known because it's a tourism destination. Mm-hmm. The Hill Country as a region is actually the second largest AVA in the United States. It's a huge land area.
Oh, wow.
And the High Plains is also very large. But the High Plains growing area is up near Lubbock, kind of over to the New Mexico border. It's on the Cap Rock, so it's got 3,000 feet of elevation, really good soil quality, good water quality, tremendous amount of sunlight. Ripening capability is tremendous. So as a growing region, it's very strong. A huge agricultural community there. So the infrastructure of being able to grow an agricultural community around viticulture has been very, very strong. In fact, most of our growers converted over from other crops, whether it be cotton or sorghum or anything like that. That's the High Plains. So that's where the majority of our fruit as a winery comes from. Country, obviously, a lot of people see pictures of the Hill Country. It's the High Plains is flat. It's almost desert-like. It's very like Eastern Washington looking.
Yeah.
The Hill Country is a lot of rock and sharp hills and very beautiful ground. However, sometimes so we have a small vineyard there. When we planted it, we pretty much had to plant it with pickaxes because I did not anticipate the level of rock that we were getting into. But Bryan falls in the Brazos River Valley Basin, very fertile area of the state. So agriculture here is very strong. The biggest challenge that we face here in the Gulf of Texas is Pierce's disease, which those that are not in the viticulture world is very limiting because it requires a lot of management to the vine, otherwise it can die. Mm-hmm. So Lenoir is not susceptible to PD, and neither is Blanc de Bois, which are the two varieties that have found the greatest amount of home here in the Gulf region of the state. However, some very interesting things that are happening right now in partnership with UC Davis. There's been a ton of research and development into new varieties that are hybrids of, Cabernet Sauvignon, Syrah, Chardonnay, things like that, hybridized to be able to have similar characteristics to their parent in terms of flavor, however, that are not susceptible to PD, that can be planted in Texas and other states that are heavily affected by PD. And actually, PD is a growing concern in California right now.
Yes. Yeah.
So there's a lot of research going into that, but as a planting area, in our soils here are fairly clay, which Lenoir actually loves. So it goes into the quality that we produce here. Hill country is very rock, and then high plains is very sandy, but sandy loam, and then you have calcareous soils deep. So another growing area that we do pull from quite a bit is from Texoma, which is north of Dallas-Fort Worth, between Dallas-Fort Worth and the Oklahoma border. Really good growing soil there too. And that area is being planted almost more currently in terms of growth than the hill country is.
Really? Now, is the demand for all this wine coming from Texas, is most of it sold within the state?
I would say 98% of the wine is sold within the state. Mm-hmm. And we're sold in 9 states wholesale, and then we ship to 42 states. In our business, we sell about 92 to 95% within Texas, and then the rest is outside. So it's minimal outside.
Mm-hmm. Now, is most of that within the 3-tier within Texas, or a lot of direct to consumer?
So we are now to the point where about 75% of our business is direct to consumer.
Oh, wow.
And we produce about 60,000 cases a year. Now we make about 200,000 gallons of wine. So if you know that leaves quite a bit of bulk. We do make bulk for other wineries. Geographically speaking, if you look at the comparison between Bryan and the High Plains, it's about a 7.5-hour drive. So when we truck that fruit, we use cold trucks to be able to keep the fruit stable. Mm-hmm. We also process some of it in the High Plains too before we bring it down. But a lot of the smaller wineries in our area, that's a fairly challenging thing. So we help them to be able to provide some additional bulk. But we only use Texas fruit at our winery. Mm-hmm. But if you look at to answer the question holistically, the number of Texas wineries that are in distribution is really only about maybe 30 or 40. Wow. Uh-huh. And maybe plus a few that self-distribute to a few of the stores that are directly around them. But at this point, the number of winery permits in the state is over 700. Now, I personally believe that we're probably somewhere around 600 physical wineries. Mm-hmm. But to have only 40 wineries sold in any type of size in the wholesale market out of 600 is pretty small.
Yeah, that is a shockingly small percentage. I wouldn't have expected that. So as you grew, to 4 locations, how did you? And it's brilliant to hit all the geographic areas. How did you manage this growth? There has to be growing pains going on there.
Absolutely. Well, it kind of goes back to that operational experience. Mm-hmm. Between my time in the Marine Corps, kind of learning how to be able to have an operational organization and kind of build it out that way, and having a good solid mission plan and operations plan. I would say that helped a lot. My wife actually was she is like extraordinarily smart. She also was a paralegal before. And so like she really has kept us organized, but she also happens to be really strong in terms of food and wine.
Mm-hmm.
And so all of our food and wine programs, she has really kind of carried that development. But probably the biggest reason why we've been able to be successful is every time we've opened a location, a lot of our focus has been finding, really strong candidates in each one of those areas and bringing them into the family and making them feel connected to the core brand. And so we've got a great management team.
Mm-hmm.
That was really challenged during COVID. The state unfortunately designated wineries as bars, and so we got shut down for quite a bit of 4 months. But the management team held it together, and we were able to shift a lot of the curbside. We did a lot of e-commerce, and we kept the ship afloat.
Well, that's great, because there is, and that was what I wanted to talk about. There is like a common thread of hospitality in all your locations, which and I was talking to Bill Wilson of Wilson Creek a week or two ago, and they're in the Temecula area in San Diego. And Temecula is also, that wine industry is also really has a huge hospitality slant to it. Versus you go up to, some of the Napa, Sonoma, where there's a winery, you can't have a wedding there, can't buy a glass of wine there. You're just there to maybe have a sip and leave. The hospitality, I think, it's really, it really helps to the average consumer, really help them introduce to the wine. They come in for the wedding, they have their wedding there, suddenly 150 people are at the winery having a great time, and they're introduced to the wine.
Well, so, you hit the nail on the head. Hospitality is really the core of who we are. It's the foundation of kind of why my parents started the way that they did.
Mm-hmm.
When they first started, they were in a mobile home with a couple of used milk tanks and a couple of used whiskey barrels. It was a super humble beginning. And they were having these people knock on their door to come sit in their living room in their mobile home to taste this wine. What they experienced in the beginning was this absolute hunger that people wanted to support this industry, and they wanted to be able to see it. And one of the first harvests that they had at the estate, and this was a great reminder for my dad because he had actually experienced this with his family. My grandfather immigrated here from Italy.
Mm-hmm.
The tradition in Messina, so we came from the Messina region. The Bonarrigo was the name of where our village was, and the Bonarrigos made the family wine, made the village wine there for 6 generations.
Mm.
So, that was a core piece of the family history. But my parents go to pick one of the first vintages off of our estate vineyard, and this group of international students comes from A&M and talks about how like they miss that feeling of being, because in Europe it's very much of a community thing. Like a lot of people know how to participate with the pick. A lot of people participate with helping around the winery and obviously drinking the wine and everything. It's a lot more than just the winery. It's really a piece of the community. And my parents got a chance to see the fact that like what we have an opportunity to be here is a lot more than just a winery. And so as they grew, they really focused on making hospitality the core to a lot of the programs, making sure that they created a destination to have a bed and breakfast, to have a restaurant, to have food options, to really never say no to the customer from the what they wanted to learn. Like we still let people pick with us in the vineyard. We want them to see that side of it. We don't kind of block them out. The mentality behind the portfolio since the very early days too was being approachable. We didn't want people to be intimidated by the wine.
Mm-hmm.
Unfortunately, wine does have somewhat of a reputation of turning their nose up at people, and that can happen, especially in some of your more prestigious tasting rooms.
Mm-hmm.
Feeling in general that like if you don't know anything, you're not welcome here.
Mm-hmm.
We wanted anybody to feel that way. We want wine to be fun. It's wine is a celebration. When you come and you don't know anything, we're here to teach you. That's the whole point.
Mm-hmm.
So they started with that idea, and that's what we try to continue on now. So every one of our locations has that mentality.
I love it. I mean, I think one thing I've seen, I've been in selling wine and involved in the industry for probably 30, 32 years or so, but it's in the last, like at least the last 8-9 years, there's almost been a democratization of wine and the experience that I see. And I firmly believe that has to do with a lot of the craft brewing and the breweries that really made it fun. You go in, you taste your 6-7 beers and got some cornhole. It becomes an actual just a community event.
Right.
And I'm so happy to see that in wineries, especially as I interview people across the country and wineries across the country. I definitely see you guys doing it right.
Thank you.
Yeah. So you got Bryan Hill Country, then Grapevine, and Harvest Green. Is that the inn? Or what is Harvest Green?
So, and to talk a little bit about Grapevine, and then I'll jump to Harvest Green because they're somewhat connected. So when we opened Hill Country, that one was part of a much bigger project. We eventually saw ourselves opening a large winemaking operation in the Hill Country. Since that time, we've changed our mentality a little bit. So we do have 4 bed and breakfast rooms in the Hill Country. We have the tasting room. We do events. We have a small vineyard on site. When we opened in Grapevine, was our first urban location. So kind of a little bit of what you're talking about, like what the craft brewers have done a great job of doing, was create that like we're part of the core of the town.
Mm-hmm.
Grapevine. If you've never been to Grape Fest, which is a festival that they throw in September, they get like 200,000 attendees to this wine festival. It's an absolutely huge festival. They built that, and we were very early participants in that. That was one of the reasons why we went there. So when we opened there on Main Street, we actually moved into a historic replica building that the CVB had previously had as their headquarters. And so we have kind of an urban feel. So we have in the back, we have our barrel and tank room that we allow people to do barrel tastings from. See some of that element. There's not like great processing on site. We do on site, and then we have events, a lot of events that happen there. And we try to participate very heavily with the town because the town does a ton of wine trails and things with all the wineries there on Main Street. Mm-hmm. But some of the lessons that we learned there really inspired us that we wanted to be a part of a community. And so as we looked at Houston area for where we would open there, we had the opportunity to be introduced to this development company called Johnson Development, and they were doing a community called Harvest Green in the west side of Houston that was kind of like a farm-centric neighborhood. So having like a golf course, they have a farm attached to their community where the residents can have little plots of land where they grow things, kind of help them to be able to learn how to tend that well and grow their own produce. And then the farmers have another plot that they grow a bunch of produce on. So Johnson wanted to do a teaching kitchen on this one piece of property. We have our Vintage House restaurant here at the estate that opened back in 1996. And so we told them, food and wine is our core tenet. I mean, like we do this stuff. And so instead of guys branching off and trying to do a teaching kitchen, let us come in. There was already actually a vineyard on site. We can help to manage the vineyard. We can help to create this food program that you're looking to create as an amenity for your residents there. And it just turned out to be the perfect opportunity. So when we opened there, we do have there's a restaurant, tasting room. There is actually a much larger production space. As we grow the vineyard there, our hope is to be able to produce about 3,000 gallons on site, which is obviously still pretty small, but we want that to be kind of that craft feel.
Sure.
Yeah.
So moving from like a traditional winery to like an urban winery, what were the challenges?
Well, I would say that probably the biggest challenges for us were just the learning curve of understanding kind of what the best ways to market to that type of environment. When a lot of people think of wine tourism. Like if you look at Fredericksburg, for example, they do a job as a town to pull a lot of tourists from Austin, San Antonio, other areas that up there, and then they drive to the different wineries, and you have the tour buses that go all over the place and everything. When you're in an urban market, so in Hill Country, about 90% of our business there is tourism. In Grapevine, about 75% of our business there is locals. So I would say, which is a little bit more like our estate winery, because Bryan and College Station, we do have quite a few locals that are regulars there. But Grapevine, the element of really being able to integrate well in the community without having a vineyard, because obviously you have to kind of explain that whole piece of it, was a little bit of a learning curve. But we had so much support from the CVB and from the local government and from the local community because of that relationship we had with them for so long, that it actually made that process a whole lot easier.
Oh, yeah. Now, you were on the board, and you served as the president of the Texas Wine and Grape Growers Association. So as far as being on this kind of overarching kind of committee or, governmental body, how do you see Texas wine and grape growing evolving over the next, decade or so?
So, I was on the board for about 8 years, including my time when I was the president. And I'm still very involved legislatively. I think that the biggest thing that we focused on while I was on the board was really being able to create a unified direction for where we can go in the industry and try to limit the splintering of kind of, for lack of a better term, sub-factions. When you look at, I would say the wine industry in general is not at a loss for passionate people that have an opinion about things.
Yeah.
So obviously, you've got all these different groups that want to do things a certain way, which is fine. And I think that's important to the ecosystem of our industry. But at the end of the day, we're all Texas wineries, and I think we have to be supportive of each other and on our direction forward. And I feel like we did a pretty good job of that. We navigated a few major challenges. We were able to get some marketing funds from the state. We were able to really solidify a few major, like for example, our viticulture and enology advisors that come from Texas A&M and Texas Tech, which have been really helpful to the growth of both vineyards and wineries. Future direction, I would say a lot of the energy right now is getting buy-in from the state, from the perspective of, like, if you look at Washington State, one of the reasons why they had a very quick growth was they had a lot of support legislatively and financially from the educational bodies there, Washington State and others, that helped to propel the research and growth for Washington wines. We're in that phase right now of having some success and being able to establish some funds to fund research projects that we really need. And I think in order for Texas to really go to its next plateau or next growth point, we're going to have to accomplish two things. One is outside the state, we need to get some recognition in terms of the quality that's being produced here, which is on my mind over the last 10 years. You see Texas wines winning all these major awards in San Francisco and European competition. We really don't get a lot of focus on that from the national media. We get some, but I think that the recognition of the quality that's happening here from a national level is not quite there. So I think that we as an industry have to be better about telling our story. Individual wineries, I think, do a pretty good job, but we as a industry, like if you look at Washington State once again, their voice is so strong, and marketing wise, they're really good at that. And then the second piece to that is, I think internally we have to leverage. So in the growth of craft distilleries and craft breweries in Texas, when they exploded, they did a great job of getting buy-in from Texans and saw that play all the way down to the grocery store. Like you start seeing these massive 300 SKU sets of craft beer go in. You don't see that from Texas wine. And I think part of that's because, once again, we as an industry have not done a great job of uniting together. I think partially because of the fact that so many wineries are so focused on the direct-to-consumer piece. But I think in order to get to that next phase, we have to get behind a initiative to be able to establish a much larger presence in the distribution of Texas wines through grocery or restaurant.
And then actually getting that national thing out, because until I started this podcast a year or so ago, I had very little knowledge of Texas wines, some knowledge of Arizona wines, but after that, I was purely either European or Oregon, Washington, California centric, even as a wine buyer. So I think you're onto something there for sure. The other thing, I guess, when you see Oregon and Washington, is even in California, there's a lot of international alignments and investments going on. Like you've got, Oregon, all the Burgundy winemakers, all the Burgundy wineries want to get their share of a piece of Oregon property, and you got a lot of Bordeaux people up in Washington.
We are seeing.
Yeah. Have you seen some international kind of involvement or alliances going on?
So, international, not, but and part of that's also because of the structure in Texas. In order to own a winery, you have to be a Texas resident.
Okay.
That hasn't stopped some. What I would say we've seen a lot more of recently has been we're starting to see a lot more West Coast investment moving, which I think that is a double-edged sword. I think that there's some positives to that because with that comes some infrastructure and knowledge. I mean, half of my production team is from the West Coast, so like obviously that is a great benefit to us to be able to leverage that experience. But we also have to make sure that we don't lose our identity.
Sure.
And not saying any specific large winery names, but some that gobble up a lot of the little guys. I hope that doesn't happen here, because one of our greatest strengths as an industry is that almost probably almost every winery is some sort of family-owned or at least closely owned winery. So we don't have any like major winery groups that have started buying out wineries yet.
That's probably a good thing, because I'm a little scared of the consolidation going on right now here in California. Some of the stuff going on, and I was talking to another Temecula. I live in San Diego, and it's just the closest wine region towards us. And a lot of Northern California wineries are buying places or wineries in Temecula, and a couple of them are ripping out the vineyards and bringing down their Northern California fruit and just bottling it there. And that's a big no-no. I mean, at least they have the laws set up where 75% of the wine has to come from the Temecula region. So you guys are preparing for that and that's probably inevitable growth.
Well, and that also kind of goes back to my second comment about getting people on board. I don't think it necessarily has so much to do with, the whole labeling regulation and everything like that. That's a whole nother topic. But one of the mindsets that, being Texas loyal, I think does lower the chances that you get somebody. Because I personally believe that if you get a West Coast winery that is interested in buying, when they do come in, they're going to do the same thing. They're going to just bring in product from outside the state and sell it. That would be my guess.
Or they're just their own kind of way of doing things. So Texas wine itself, as we're kind of wrapping down here, give me your top synopsis of what sets Texas wine apart as far as flavor profiles and style.
So, I think a couple things. The selection of different varieties that grow well in Texas is incredibly diverse. And there's some very unique things. I mean, like, for example, the variety that we have since 2012 invested a lot of energy into is Sagrantino. And so you don't see a lot of that in the U.S. We actually make more Sagrantino in Texas than is made on the West Coast.
I love that varietal. Drink a lot of it, but I've not had a domestic one. It's always from Italy.
So that is one example, but we have no problem ripening here.
Mm-hmm.
So
yeah, you were telling me you just harvested. We're actually recording this in end of July here.
Yeah. So this year is a little bit odd, I would say, because of the drought conditions that we're currently in, and heat. A lot of people look at the heat map this year. We have had quite a few days above 100. That's not exactly normal. So we are hotter and drier than normal. But the high plains is normally very dry, so they rely heavily on irrigation. But that also creates a great ripening region. That harvest normally starts at the beginning of August. The Gulf Coast normally starts as early as the end of June / middle to early July. So we are a little bit earlier than we anticipated because we did have a late bud break this year, but because of the drought and heat, it's looking like it's going to come very quickly to harvest across the state. So that is a little bit unique. But in terms of the special characteristics of Texas wine, I would say that a lot of it does come to the fruit characteristics of the wine. You get those really intense ripe fruit flavors, and it brings out the varietal characteristics of no matter what varietal that you're growing. We also can get really good extraction, so great tannin structure, richness, a lot of flavors like that. We focus a lot on our kind of fine tuning each variety in terms of like the oak profiles that it ages in, the different toasts that we use in the winery, the different techniques that we use in terms of maceration times, what type of yeast that we use. So I think every variety kind of handles that differently.
Mm-hmm.
So I would say that we're still, we have found a lot of success in the types of varieties that we are successful with, mm-hmm. but I feel like we're kind of still in the beginnings of solidifying that. Because like one variety that, Cabernet has very consistently grown well in Texas.
Mm-hmm.
And it is, it's a unique characteristic in Texas. I would say that you do get less kind of that herbaceous note that's classic with Cabernet, more ripe flavors. But I think that Texas wine has really a deep soul, and we have a lot to explore to really bring out more and more of kind of the different varieties that do well here.
Oh, absolutely. So putting you a little bit on the spot here, outside of Messina Hof, in Texas, what are some of the projects you're most excited about right now?
Well, I would say that this also touches back on your previous question too a little bit. So right now, I would say the last 5 to 8 years, maybe a little bit more than that, I've been very focused on Italian varietals. Mm-hmm. They do seem to perform very well as like, any Mediterranean varietals seem to perform well here in Texas. But there's been a few growth projects, especially in the high plains from the growers out there, as well as seeing that flow through to some of the wineries producing the Sangiovese, Montepulciano, Sagrantino. I'm really excited to see kind of that starting to take root. Mm-hmm. So, in terms of specific wineries that are doing some cool things, I'm not thinking of anything specifically off the top of my head. I know that in the past, like we've worked with Llano Estacado on a few projects that they've done very well with. But really, it's more the vineyard development, like Lehe Vineyards and Leopard Vineyards and Young Family Vineyards are three of the biggest ones that we work with.
Okay, yeah. And what AVA are those in?
Those are all the high plains.
All high plains, okay.
And so we're starting to see some experimental varieties like Cortese and Fiano. Oh. Some other Italian varietals that had not been planted here before that are being planted now as experiments. So I'm excited to see what that plays out with.
Yeah, that's super exciting. So Paul, as we're kind of wrapping down here, where can people find out more about you and Messina Hof?
Probably the best place is our website, which is www.messinahof.com. That branches off into all of our locations as well as our portfolio. You can buy our wines online. You can look at our events. You can look at our press information about previous projects and things that we've done. That's kind of the heart of information. And of course, social media. We're very active on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, other social avenues. We've been involved with all that.
I do have to compliment you on your website. It's one of the better winery websites I've seen. And we do websites as a business, and man, your guys is one of the better ones I've seen this year. And I especially love that timeline in your About Us page. That's really cool. Just from a techie geek standpoint. I did like it.
Telling that story is so important, and I think that sometimes we take for granted. Being around since 1977, that's many years of blood, sweat, and tears that went into growing the business and the industry. So when we celebrated our 40th anniversary, we kind of took a moment to take a step back and try to find historical pictures and things, because over that time, my parents had been going so quickly that a lot of that stuff had been put in boxes in attics and things. Mm-hmm. So,
and I saw you guys you just had a book come out.
So my parents just launched a book. So my parents had actually released 3 cookbooks before.
Oh.
That was featuring, instead of the food first and then the wine, it's if you're drinking this wine, this is the food that you should have. But then the most recent book that they launched was all about kind of their thought about join the family, and it gave the history of their journey, not just Messina Hof, but also kind of as in parallel the Texas wine industry along with it, because they're kind of in that mode now. So they've been technically retired since 2015, but they still like to be involved. It's still their baby. They like the social aspects of it. My dad still loves making wine beside me, especially for our palatier. But they also they don't want that story to be forgotten. Our industry now is going through a really cool second generation phase where a lot of our early pioneers have either transitioned or are in the process of transitioning to either the younger generation or new owners. Mm-hmm. And you especially know this, but a lot of times that knowledge is lost.
Yeah.
They want to make sure that they captured that. So that's what the book is about.
Well, that's fantastic. And people can find the book on the website, messinahof.com. Paul, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you.
Have a great day.
You too.
Thanks for listening to the Legends Behind the Craft podcast. We'll see you again next time, and be sure to click subscribe to get future episodes.